All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition for September of First Wednesdays with Savas Beatie authors here on Civil War Seattle. Tonight, I'm very happy to be joined by Joe Owen and Scott Mingus Sr., who have been co-authors on the book you see here on the screen, Unceasing Fury, Texans at the Battle of Chickamauga. So will be our topic of discussion tonight, is going to be their book and everything about writing it and researching it and the story of the book itself. So as we get started here, why don't you, we'll start with Joe, since you're just below me here on the screen, and introduce yourselves to everybody. Let us know who you are, and then we'll follow up with Scott.
Sure. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Joe Owen, and I am co-author with Scott Mingus on our book about the Texans at Chickamauga. I'm a National Park Ranger, and I work at Lyndon B National Historical Park in Johnson City, Texas. I've been an avid Civil War enthusiast since I was a little boy, when my dad was stationed in Alexandria, Virginia, in the U.S. government. And I remember going to Petersburg. And my mom said I climbed all over the monuments, but this was back in the late 60s, when you can get away with that when you're a kid. I've always been interested in the Civil War, and I've been fortunate enough to written 5 books, and have Scott Mingus as my co-author is outstanding. To me, it's like I'm a AAA team, and I got Babe Ruth as my starting lineup. So I've just really been fortunate, and with research, I've just been fascinating with various databases, and I can get into that later. But that's pretty much the quick and brief biography of me.
All right, and Scott, the prolific author, Scott Mingus.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Richard. I'm Scott Mingus. I'm a native of southeastern Ohio. a retired scientist and global executive in the pulp and paper industry. Patented scientist, sold patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. So you can thank me every time you don't have to lick your postage stamp, I guess. I've written 33 Civil War books so far, and continue to do that. I've got 2 more in the works right now.
So, Scott, a lot of the books that I've seen of yours are based on Pennsylvania-related Civil War history in and around Gettysburg and South Central Pennsylvania. And Joe, is your work primarily involved Texas so far with your Civil War? So now, how did this peanut butter and jelly come together here with this book? If you're not to say that you're exclusively South Central Pennsylvania, but I think that's what people are familiar with your work for. So how did you guys get connected? How did you guys choose this as a topic? What was really the impetus for beginning this entire thing?
That's a good question. I collected so many accounts. Let me go back a little bit. I was primarily interested in Hood's Texas Brigade at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I always told myself, I'm going to stop at Gettysburg. I don't want to know anything about the Western theater of the war. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to stop at Gettysburg and start up at Eltham's Landing, which was the first battle of the Hood's Texas Brigade. I got into the research when about 7 years ago, when I was reading Michael Hardy's book, North Carolina at Gettysburg, and that was the soldiers' accounts, and Keith Jones, Georgia at Gettysburg. And then I picked up Scott's book, The Louisiana Tigers in the Gettysburg campaign, and I was just impressed. And always had in the back of my mind I'd like to work with Scott, but at the same time I was collecting all these accounts. And Scott not only is an outstanding historian, but he's an outstanding narrator. He's an outstanding storyteller. What would take me 7 years would take Scott just maybe a few months to weave in the story with the facts. I found a lot of the accounts about Chickamauga quite hesitantly, because I said, I'm not going to do Chickamauga. I'm not going to do it. But the more accounts I found, the more fascinated I was with all the Texas regiments. So I got all these accounts together, and it took about 3 or 4 years for me to get all these accounts. And then one day I just messaged Scott and I said, would you be interested in being a co-author with me about the Texans that fought at Chickamauga? and quite happily said, I've always been interested about, he said, I've been to Chickamauga, and I've always been interested more about the unit stuff fought there, and it'd be a pleasure. And I was like, woohoo, yeah, that's great. And so working with Scott has been an absolute pleasure. We pretty much know what we're interested in. Scott gives ideas back and forth. We collaborated almost every day about, what should be in it, what should not be in it, what accounts really should be emphasized, what's not. And it was an outstanding partnership. It really is.
And Scott, had you, before you tell your side of it, just quickly, have you dipped your toe in the Western theater waters prior to this, writing-wise and research-wise, or was this your first venture into the other side of the Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, research-wise, no. I mean, I've obviously long been interested in the Western theater. In fact, I've had one great-grandfather fight in the Western theater, mostly in Ohio regiments. So I've always been interested in the topic, but never interested enough to write a book, because living here in South Central Pennsylvania, there was plenty of material for me to write books, about what happened here, and of course down in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, which is my other passion. So this has long been an interest to me. And when Joe came with the opportunity, it was like, I know I've got my own files on what Ohio regiments did at Chickamauga, for example, things like that. What the 51st Ohio in particular was doing at Chickamauga. So this was a natural opportunity for me to kind of branch out and do something a little different, because, as a lot of people know, my expertise is certainly the Gettysburg campaign. But a lot of these guys were at Gettysburg, particularly obviously the Texans, and then later troops from Gettysburg from the Union Army were transferred out west to serve at Chattanooga and at Missionary Ridge. So, this was a natural extension, and I appreciated Joe and Ted Savas when he agreed to write to subsidize the book and get it published. It's been great. I've appreciated it.
Yeah. So what was, when you chose the state level approach, in the forward to your book, he wrote, kind of that this is a common treatment that we see at Antietam, studies of Antietam and Gettysburg and things, but not only is it lacking in Chickamauga studies, but the Western theater in general doesn't have a lot of brigade level histories or state level histories. It's sort of battle or commander level stuff, or the individual soldiers kind of stories. What made you guys decide that really this is the fit, this is the way to approach it, rather than just the Texas Brigade, for example, that you thought, let's bring in all of Texan accounts and that sort of stuff? Because it's an innovative approach, because they're so scattered and they're not as unified as New York at Gettysburg. That's, the monuments are there, it's cohesive, the historiography is sort of established. But what you guys did is it's an innovative thing, and I'm curious how you came to that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's unique about it is the fact that, as Joe and I have talked about, is we can tell virtually the entire story of the Battle of Chickamauga through Texas accounts, because there were Texans at every single major part of this battle. If you go to Gettysburg, there weren't New Yorkers at every part. There weren't Ohioans at every part. There weren't Texans. There weren't Georgians. I mean, the battle is so split up with guys from all over the place that, to say, a friend of mine, Rich Baumgartner, wrote a book years ago, Buckeye Blood, Ohio at Gettysburg. Well, that's fantastic, but it only covers, limited parts of the first and second and third days where Ohio participated. You got to fill in the blanks. With this, we can tell the whole story of the entire battle, and that was, what really drew me to
I see,
to what Joe's research here, because he's got accounts from literally every part of the field.
Well, why don't we move into that a little bit, and perhaps we can start with the story, maybe a little background on who these Texas soldiers were. There's some things that, with my work with the veterans in Seattle, it's very comparable, because there's such a diversity of soldiers that lived here, that I can tell. I do a program called Seattle at Gettysburg, and we tell the entire story of Gettysburg through the accounts of these individuals, because they were everywhere on the battlefield. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I've learned so much about our Western state Union troops, the men from Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, most of them were not born there. They were children of people who had migrated there, you know, or when they were children. And that caught my attention with the Texans, that, wow, this is a Southern version of that. These are men who weren't born there, but it's their home, and then they're choosing to defend it. And so maybe tell us a little bit about who these, in a broad sense, who these Texans are and why they're fighting for the Confederacy.
Sure. A lot of these Texans, well, Texas in general around 1850 to 1860 had a lot of people from the East Coast settled in Texas for land, for opportunity. Some for the adventure. You know, you had Davy Crockett in the Alamo. You had the Mexican-American War. And some were just interested in going to new lands, and some were more interested in the history of Texas, so they wanted to see it for themselves. But not very many Texans that fought in the Civil War were actually born and raised in Texas. They usually
are most around.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, are most of them, they're still Southerners by birth, though? They're from North Carolina and Georgia.
Oh, sure.
Or is it still?
By and large. And, you know, I made an interesting point. Why did they fight for the Confederacy? Well, people have to remember, back then the communications were not as fast and developed as they are now. A lot of the men and women who received their news from the state newspaper, they couldn't get like the New York Times or other, you know, newspapers from around the country. They got their news from the local capital like Austin or from Waco or from Houston, and that's the news they got. And when the newspaper said that Texas is going to be invaded by you know, outside of Texans, they were kind of alarmed. You know, that's how you got your news. You didn't get it instantaneously like we do now. So they had to rely upon newspaper articles. They had to rely on, you know, what the local government was saying, what the state government was saying, because a lot of these people also, they didn't really travel exclusively outside of Texas, you know, and also, you know, a lot of these Texans could not afford to have a slave, and a lot of them didn't. Now, Texas, that was a lot more prominent than it was in, let's say, Central Texas or West Texas. But a lot of these men, they just thought, you know what, you know, we're being asked by the governor, we're being asked to fight to defend Texas and defend, you know, a way of life. Because, you know, I remember in the movie Gettysburg, the gentleman who played General Kemper, he said, you know, Washington, D.C. is a foreign government 2,000 miles away. You know, it's like we're getting invaded by a foreign country. And that really stuck out with a lot of Texans. It's like, we don't know who these people are. Why do they want to invade? Why do they want to fight? You know, so they were called upon by the governor and by Jefferson Davis, who, you know, used to be the Secretary of War. And
so sectional loyalties, really.
Oh, yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
And a lot of these soldiers also, they never had any military experience, you know, at all. John Gregg, who was the general at Chickamauga, he was a mathematics professor before the war. You had a lot of these shopkeepers. You had a lot of merchants. But then again, you had a lot of men. And the reason why I like to talk about the Texans is a lot of these Texans were from the frontier. They knew how to use a rifle. They knew how to use a knife. And they were used to being, you know, defending themselves against hostile, you know, banditos or Comanches or Kiowas. And so a lot of these men knew what they were going to get into. And some of these men really enjoyed fighting and, you know, like the Old West.
So I think when people think of Texans, a layman's perspective of Texans in the Civil War, you obviously think of the cornfield, the assault on Little Round Top with the Texas Brigade, and then perhaps I think his name's I forget the soldier's name. The famous photo of the Texan with the leopard skin chaps.
Oh yeah,
Marshbanks, I think his name is. And so there's of two opposite ends of the spectrum. That's Texas in the Civil War, is either the sort of gunslinging Wild West-ish Texan or those that fought under Robert E. Lee. But that is obviously not the full extent of it. And with what you guys present here, there's a real coming together of Texans from all different aspects of the Confederacy at this battle. So one quick question, and then I'd like to have maybe Scott get into some of the commanders that we're going to talk about, and then maybe we can just go into the narrative of the battle and start getting into that side of things. I was curious, and I'd like to know your thoughts. That was this coming together of Texans from various armies and assignments prior to the Battle of Chickamauga. Was this really the greatest concentration of Texan soldiers in combat during the Civil War?
I mean, I think so. I mean, one thing to take a look at is where these guys came from. There were Texans already in Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, but he was reinforced by a group of Texans that had been surrendered to William Tecumseh Sherman at Fort Hyman at the Battle of Arkansas Post. They had been paroled after most of them had been to Chicago at various prisons. They had been sent back to the Confederate Army after being exchanged. They had joined the Army after the battles of Murfreesboro, for example. You had guys coming up from Enterprise, Mississippi, from Joseph Johnston's army, who had fought at the Battle of Raymond, etc. They had joined the army as well. As Joe has already described, we had Hood's Texans transferred from the Army of Northern Virginia by rail. And one of what I think is one of the most interesting parts of the whole book is we talk about the travails, if you will, of these Texas soldiers who are heading, via North Carolina and South Carolina before they get to Georgia and have to come back up through north from Atlanta. So this is, I would suggest this probably is, if not the largest, it's certainly the most diverse group of soldiers assembled at any Civil War battlefield from the state of Texas. There's no doubt of that.
So how about we have a number of images from the book, portraits of relevant commanders, brigade, and perhaps division, some individuals that we can talk about. Would you like to, should we start with those and maybe introduce us to some of these commanders, and then we can loop back to the lead up to the actual fight at Chickamauga?
Yeah, Joe, why don't you take the generals and I'll take the start of the tactics of the battles.
Sure. Okay, let's do that. I'll click through here. So this is General. He still has Colonel insignia on his collar here, but this is Bachelor, right? That's who we're looking at. Is this a good place to start? We can go through a couple of these. You can give us a little background, and then at least we'll know who Scott's talking about when we get there and where they're coming from.
Well, James Bachelor was a Union officer before the war. He was stationed out west. He was stationed Midwest, and he joined the Confederate Army when in 1861. Scott made an interesting point about soldiers being familiar with each other. James Bachelor was captured at Arkansas Post, which was a humiliating defeat of an early battle for the Confederate Army, and he was brought up to William Tecumseh Sherman, and General Sherman said, "Hey, I think I know your family," and they were from Ohio, Pennsylvania. And of course, James Bachelor says, "I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know anybody like you." And so it was like it was a familiarity. James Bachelor was an outstanding. He was very popular. He was described as a short man, a stocky man, and energetic. And he really, really took after his troops, and that's how he died. So I'm going to move fast forward a little bit about James Bachelor. He died because when he was checking the men's ammunition, because they were saying, "Sir, where's the ammunition? We need to have it." And so he was checking the weapons wagons when he was pretty much had a huge shot go through his chest, and that's how he died. But one thing about Bachelor is that General Robert E. Lee said, he made a comment, said that there was none braver than Bachelor in the Confederate Army, and so his loss very, very grievous at the Battle of Chickamauga. But he was a Union officer. He was he was stationed out west. He was stationed fighting Native Americans, and a lot of these soldiers who did join the Confederate Army with prior Army experience were Union officers that got their beginning at the Mexican-American War.
All right. And then how about next? Another name that will take up a lot of the tactical discussion is Ector. So who's this guy in his non-military garb? He clearly survived the war. This looks to be a post-war photograph. So maybe you could tell everybody his background and significance.
Matthew Ector, of course, part of the Ector's Texas Brigade, was an outstanding commanding officer. He was a flirtatious. He was a widower. His wife died before the war, and when he joined the Confederate Army, you know, he didn't really have that much military experience before the war, and a lot of these commanding officers really didn't, but they really did adapt very well to Army life, to cavalry and infantry life. One thing about Matthew Hector, he liked to be in women's company, and one of his soldiers complained that, you know, he was always at a cotillion. He was always dragging his officers out to go to a dance, and the officer said, you know, I'm getting tired of this. You know, General Hector, he likes to flirt too much, and he's an interesting man. He was an outstanding cavalryman, another fellow Texan who did survive the war, and he was also wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga as well.
Oh, okay. And then next is Maxie Gregg. Is that, I'm not screwing that up, right? Yeah, Maxie Gregg. Okay. Oh, this is John Gregg. Okay.
John Gregg,
where am I getting Maxie from? That's another brigade commander, I think. Sorry. It's a confusing battle for sure. Even to keep the name straight from your book, it's confusing.
John Gregg settled in Texas in around 1852, and he was a mathematics professor when Fort Sumter was fired upon. And of course, he joined as a private, and he risen through the ranks very quickly. He was an outstanding officer, young officer, and he came kind of to an inglorious ending. He was shot through the neck at Chickamauga, and he was very close to being captured by Union troops, and it was Hood's Texans who found him. He was actually, when he was shot, you know, he was right near Union troops, and he knew that they were coming, and there was a patrol, and he had to play dead while they were pretty much took all the weapons from his body. And, you know, he had to play dead. And so when the Texans found him, you know, it's like, oh, my goodness, this is General Gregg, and it was Hood's Texans. And right during one interesting thing is the University of Texas battle song is "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You." Well, that kind of came from General John Gregg, because at the Battle of the Wilderness, Robert E. Lee wanted to take Hood's Texans, the 5th Texas and 4th Texas, and take them onto a charge. And of course, the Texans said, no, Marshal Roberts, go to the rear, go to the rear. And we're not going to go if you lead us, because they didn't want him to get killed. And so they led him to the rear. And it was General Gregg who said, Hood's boys, the eyes of General Lee are upon you. And over time, it'd be the eyes of Texas are upon you. And so if you ever hear the Texas UT fighting song, it's kind of, you know, originated by John Gregg indirectly.
Cool.
But yeah, he was shot through, you know, it was terrible. He was shot through the neck and almost, you know, was pretty badly wounded. And then he was shot through the neck again fatally. And he was just married. He was only married a couple months before he died. Oh, and there's General John Bell Hood.
Yeah, John Hood probably doesn't require too much discussion, but just the fact that so many people, you know, just Hood's Texans, it's just burned into popular memory, even though he wasn't the longest term commander of that brigade, right? Robertson commanded for a longer period of time, but he, in so many people's opinion, is Texas in the Civil War, is this face of Hood. So there's a couple. Robertson we could talk about a little bit more, but I do want to we're getting on about 25 minutes here, so I want to give Scott the opportunity to get rolling here onto the narrative. And then Joe, as you see fit, if there's things, you know, commanders that we want to drop in, I'll let you guys go through that. But I'll start with this map. This is September 18th, 1863. Scott makes a good case for the battle being considered the 18th, 19th, and 20th, whereas some perhaps compartmentalize it down to just the 19th and 20th. So we'll start with this map, but if you want to start earlier in how we wind up here a little bit, you can, or just the floor is yours, Scott, to tell us the story and weave the Texans in and out. Joe, you can enliven it with some really some of these great accounts that you found over the years that really build the substance of the book. So yeah, let's hear about Chickamauga. What happens? Who are these Texans? Why should we care? Like, what makes this significant in the war? So on.
Yeah, just very quick background. On December 31st, 1862 and July 1st, 1863, Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee had fought William Rosecrans' Army of the Ohio pretty much to a standstill. They beat each other to pieces at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a battle that the Union called Stone's River. Throughout the winter and spring of 1863, the armies pretty much stared at each other. Bragg had retreated into the central highlands of central Tennessee, and not a lot happened. There were some periodic battles and fights, and then eventually Bragg starts pulling out after being defeated in a couple of these battles. He withdraws deeper towards Tullahoma, and will eventually, by the late spring, early summer, he's retreated back to Chattanooga. Now, Chattanooga is a very critical spot for the Confederacy. There's 4 railroads that merge in and around Chattanooga. You've got, obviously, the river. You've also got a number of roads, including some key roads that lead to the south into Georgia, all the way down to Atlanta. Surprisingly, Bragg pulls out of Chattanooga, and the War Department keeps pushing him to stop retreating and start attacking the Yankees. Well, at the same time, Abraham Lincoln's been prodding Rosecrans to attack the Confederates. Things finally come to a head in mid-September when the two armies are now in northwestern Georgia. Both armies start moving, ironically, at the same time to the northeast. Bragg thinks he can slip around Rosecrans' left flank, not realizing that Rosecrans is moving in the same direction. So this is West Chickamauga Creek, where the two armies are going to engage one another. There's a few small fords in this very deep, very cold, swift-moving West Chickamauga Creek. There are also a couple key bridges. The bridge at the top is Reed's Bridge. The bridge in the middle is Alexander's Bridge. And so the fighting on September 18th takes place in and around these sites. Go ahead to the next map. The Texans get involved at Reed's Bridge, where John Gregg's 7th Texas, with Hood's Texas Brigade under Robertson in support, they will start pushing their way across this small wooden bridge. As what happens at Alexander's Bridge, the Yankees are trying to take up the bridge planks, but they don't destroy the bridge. And they leave enough planks in enough spots that the Confederates can relatively easily put the bridges back into commission and start pouring across. So there are a number of Union cavalrymen that are trying to stop this attack, both at Reed's Bridge and at Alexander's Bridge. But eventually, throughout September 18th, the pressure of the Confederates is just too much, and the Union is forced to retire. That gives Braxton Bragg the opportunity now to start moving the bulk of his army across West Chickamauga Creek into a position to start attacking the Union forces. Joe, you want to add anything about these two fights?
You've done pretty good, my friend. Not much more to add.
I mean, one thing I want to add, because it's kind of somewhat interesting, is at Alexander's Bridge, one of the defenders there is John T. Wilder's Lightning Brigade. They are armed with repeating rifles, and so they're going to lay down a tremendous amount of firepower that's actually going to delay the Confederate attack on Alexander's Bridge. And it's not until that Wilder actually withdraws before the attack here, the defenders here, Colonel William Minty, will retire as well. So September 18th ends with a rare night fight where the 7th Texas will control a road and try to probe the Union lines. And as they're doing that, in the night, there's a whole bunch of shooting and fighting, but really inconsequential. September 18th pretty much stops with both armies still on the move to the northeast, and everything's going to break loose on the morning of the 19th. So if you want to go there.
Yeah. I have one quick question. Maybe this is the right map to answer this because it's zoomed in so much. To maybe describe a little bit for people the nature of the terrain here.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's this battle is known for its chaotic character, and it's really kind of a soldier's fight because it's the terrain dictates the different things. And as I look at this, I can kind of see maybe not the most famous clearings and fields on the battlefield, but I think this one's zoomed in enough that maybe this is a good one to explain what these soldiers were fighting in and why that's unique to this battlefield.
Yeah, I mean, if you're most of us who are familiar with the Eastern Theater are quite familiar with the Battle of the Wilderness, which is this ungodly mix of secondary growth and underbrush and thickets. Well, Chickamauga is pretty much the same, only in spades. This is a massive, massive battlefield. It's very, very large. It rivals Gettysburg in terms of its overall size. But the big difference is you don't have major cleared fields and farms with lots of outbuildings and huge barns and lots of fence lines and stone walls. That really didn't exist. These are small, hard scrabble farms, usually with a small barn, maybe chicken coop or one or two small outbuildings, and very small log cabins in many cases. So these are, definitely not the wealthy farmers of, Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania that we think of when we think of these Eastern battles. These are poor, hard scrabble, dirt farmers that are trying to make a living on these very small clearings. And frankly, the soil is pretty poor. This is not conducive to farm life. It's most certainly not a great place to fight a battle either. Yeah.
Would you maybe, for some that are familiar with the wilderness or Eastern battlefields, maybe I think of the Widow Tap field or Saunders Field at the Wilderness. Are those the kind of clearings that maybe 2 regiments, 3 regiments, and maybe an artillery battery can have a couple hundred yards? So, and then otherwise it's closed in with that same kind of forest.
Yeah, you're not going to have a Pickett's charge or even like the Cleveland's charge of Franklin, even, or things like that. Just and Hood's Texans are a great example. I mean, they're going to find one of the only clearings of any substance in the battles we'll talk about as we go forward. But yeah, this is just really, really bad terrain. It's also leads to one critical thing to remember about the battle as we move forward. The generals can't see what's happening. Where at Gettysburg, a lot of other battles, Robert E. Lee surveys most of the terrain. He can see what's happening. Bragg and Rosecrans don't have a clue. In fact, a lot of people will say this is a soldier's battle that's really fought by the colonels and the captains and lieutenants on the ground, because even the division commanders, the brigade commanders, and most certainly the army commanders do not know what's going on throughout much of this battle.
All right. Well, let's move ahead. This is the morning of the 19th, right? Am I on the right map? Okay.
The fighting starts on the northeastern side of the battlefield, where dismounted Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest are going to launch a series of attacks. Here's Matthew Ector that Joe talked about earlier, leads his Texas Brigade into action. They're going to fight a number of veteran Union soldiers, including some U.S. regulars that are going to come into action as well. Ector's men are going to get forced back. They're going to counterattack a second time. They're going to get pushed back again. And in essence, they're pretty much out of the fighting on the 18th. But what all this does, the importance of what the Texans are doing, is it's pinning again the fact that this is the flank of the Union Army. And I look at this part on September 19th as a zipper being zipped. These two sides are moving northward, coming together, and they're engaging, piece by piece, actually from the northeast back to the southwest, almost like a zipper. They're engaging and they're staying locked in combat. The next groups are coming together. They're being locked into combat. More and more troops are coming. So by the time September 19th ends, virtually the entire 2 armies, the Army of Tennessee and the Army of Ohio, are now engaged within a matter of a few hundred yards, starting out being widely separated and coming together. So that analogy of a zipper is a really good way, I think, of looking at the tactics, particularly in September 19th.
Oh, go ahead, Joe.
Also, this is the day where James Longstreet became involved. Really, he was leading, his troops from the Eastern Theater of the War, and that's when he started coming in. That's when you had other regiments. Not only did the Texans from Robert E. Lee's army join in the battle, but you had South Carolinians. They also were part of Longstreet's corps. And one thing was it was a 3-day train ride from Virginia to Georgia, and as soon as Hood's Texans, all the Texans of Hood's brigade didn't arrive all at once. It was kind of a matter of, some arrived on the 19th, some arrived on the 20th. But one thing which was really interesting is pretty much as soon as they got off the train, they were going into battle. I mean, they said, okay, form up, your food, and go right in, boys. And one thing which was a kind of a shock for for the other Texans, which was kind of a detriment. The Western Theater Texans really didn't have a uniform that was, all men wore the same uniform. They were pretty much, a lot of them were in civilian clothes. They didn't really have a set standard. And so before Hood's Texans went to Georgia, they all got brand new uniforms from the Richmond Depot. And so they a lot of the Western troops were confusing them with Yankees. And it was like, oh my God, sure, they're wearing blue uniforms. And a lot of the times they, the Hood's Texans said, hey, no, we're not Union forces. We're a part of you. Don't shit at us. Yeah. And one thing that a lot of these Longstreet's Corps, when they went down to Chickamauga, they were really not used to having the Western Union troops standing almost to the last man and fighting. These men in the Western Theater, a lot of them were woodsmen. You had a lot of them, who hunted. I mean, of course, a lot of the soldiers, in both theaters were hunters. Yeah. But it was really, Hood's Texas Brigade, they were impressed. They were really impressed with saying these Western Confederates will stand to the end and they know how to shoot. And I don't think the Army under George Meade or even George McClellan were as good shots as these Western boys were.
Yeah. Do you find, have either of you found anything in accounts where there's anything expressed between the Texans about, or the Confederates in general, between maybe those who were already in these armies that were already fighting under Bragg and Johnston, and then here comes these highfalutin, holier than thou men from Lee's army, and they come in. Was there any? Because you see that with Sherman's army at the end of the war when they're going to Washington, and how the Army of the Potomac is white gloves and polished buttons, and Sherman's army is just as dirty and worn out as can be. And I wonder if that existed on the Confederate side, because this would be a great opportunity to see that.
I don't think so. Now,
no.
This may or may not be a true story, but there was a soldier named J.P. Polley from the 4th Texas who wrote in his account that of the battle that they were going down the road and they were marching right past the 8th Texas Cavalry, Terry's Texas Rangers. And he said, Terry's Texas Rangers, I consider them as equal as our brigade, because these are the men who fought bravely. And, these are the men that are worthy of being saluted by the Texas troops, by Hood's boys. And so while they were crossing the road and seeing each other, they take off their hats and they take off their, take out their neckerchiefs. Now, one thing you have to remember is you had a lot of these men in both armies, like there's a soldier named George Todd of the 1st Texas. He recognized his brother and went to go see his brother, and he was in the 2nd Texas. And so a lot of these men were related to each other, and a lot of them had these little mini reunions, so they didn't really look down at each other because, a lot of these soldiers were related.
Came from the same communities and things, I see.
Yeah, one other key point on that as well is keep in mind, as Joe pointed out, it's a very important point, that Hood's Texans dressed, as they are in their brand new uniforms, are hot rushed into action into one small sector. So only the guys that are in that sector. Guys.
Okay.
So they're not parading around the army for days on end.
Yeah.
Where everybody knows who they are. In fact, a lot of these guys have no clue that Lee's men are even on the way.
Yeah, that's
all of a sudden
a good point.
They show up, and here they are. And then Longstreet shows up, and everybody's kind of like, "Who's he?" Well, they know who he is, but they don't have a clue that he's there. And so there's really not a time for any resentment. I mean, these Texans come in and they start shooting. And in fact, if you go on to the next map, I mean, this shows exactly what's going on. Here's John Gregg's 7th Texas. Then, as Joe mentioned, Gregg's going to get shot down in the middle of this woods. Well, Hood's Texans come roaring into action. Go on to the next map. We should show that, I think. So, as Gregg is now out of action, here comes Robertson's Texans. And again, only the guys who are around him. I mean, look who's behind him. That's Benning. They're used to these Texans. They're from the Army of Northern Virginia as well. So in the matter of these guys showing up, there's really nobody in Bragg's traditional army that has even seen these guys, and here they are suddenly launching an attack. Now, one thing that's really kind of neat that our viewers might enjoy his story is if you look on the 2 arrows that are parallel that say routed on the left of the map, there's a unit there called Lily. That is an Indiana artillery battery that was creating a lot of chaos for the Texans as they charged the Vineyard Farm. That is Eli Lilly. So the pharmaceutical manufacturer, this is him. He's a captain of an artillery battery from Indiana.
Oh.
He's so appalled by all the guys that he sees gunned down and shot down, including what his batteries had did, that he ends up devoting the rest of his life to finding cures for various diseases and various medicines and things like that. And Eli Lilly's pharmaceutical company is a direct result of Lilly's experiences in the Civil War.
Wow.
And so one thing, if I can make, oh, go ahead, Scott. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Joe, please.
One quick story about you mentioned. On the other map, there's Haig. Hans Haig was a colonel from Wisconsin. He was a Norwegian, and he was killed presumably by one of the Hood's Texas boys. And he was the highest-ranking Union officer from Wisconsin that was killed during the war. One thing which is related to modern times is a few years ago, when after the chaos at Charlottesville, considering the statues, that some people, some of the public marched onto the Wisconsin grounds and actually tore down Haig's monument at the Capitol grounds in Milwaukee. And they were like, they didn't know who he was, but it was Hans Haig who was killed right there at Chickamauga, and he was an outstanding officer who was at the wrong time at the wrong place. And I kind of found it interesting that his monument was torn down, and he was the highest ranking colonel from Wisconsin.
Yeah, just to finish on this, the Hood's Texans are not able to penetrate the Union lines. In fact, very few of the Confederate attacks at this point of the field actually work. And so as September 19th comes to a close, there's one more attack that we do want to talk about just briefly, and that is Patrick Cleburne's attack. This is one of the few Confederate attacks on the 19th that actually penetrates the Union line and drives Yankees back. This is Deschler. Joe had described Jim Deschler earlier. He's the guy who had been captured at Arkansas Post, and now he's brigadier general. He's leading his men. These are dismounted cavalrymen. Their horses have been taken away from them or had never been issued to them when they first became soldiers. They fought as infantry, so they're using infantry tactics. They're using infantry weapons. They're called dismounted cavalry, but they're not traditional dismounted cavalry that we would think about with horse holders and carbines, things like that. No. Pistols, sabers. No, these are infantrymen who have been drawn out of the ranks of originally being assigned as cavalrymen. But they're going to launch this night attack, and this is really vicious. The trees actually catch on fire in this part of the battlefield from the cannon flashes, because there's been a drought situation in this part of Georgia for months and months and months. You have guys burning to death, similar to the wilderness. That's why I call this the wilderness of the West. But this attack by Cleburne drives the Yankees back. But again, because it's happening deep into the night, they're unable to really accomplish much from this. And so as everything settles down on the 19th, let's go push ahead to the 20th, where Rosecrans and Bragg are going to continue.
Is this the second part of this? This is the 20th. Okay, sorry, I just saw the word Cleburne. Okay,
right map up.
Okay,
yeah. So on September 20th, again, as on the 19th, Bragg is going to launch attacks starting at that flank. He's fixated on that left flank of the Union Army, and so he's going to launch a number of attacks doing that. During one of the early morning attacks, Benjamin Helm, who is a kinsman of Mary Todd Lincoln, will be shot and will be killed, mortally wounded, which will send the White House, or Executive Mansion as was known in those days, into mourning. But these attacks, again, are going to pick up steam. You've got Deschler again with Cleburne launching another spirited attack. They're going to be repulsed. That's when Deschler is going to die, as Joe mentioned earlier, trying to get ammunition for his men in this prolonged firefight with the Yankees on the Kelly salient, as it's called. So Cleburne's attack, again, it's not going to do really much. Go ahead to the next map. All it's going to do is kill Deschler and kill a lot of Texans and Ohioans. But then Union troops started making mistakes. John Brandon and some of Thomas Wood, some of the forces under them will misconstrue orders, and they'll leave a gap in the Union line on the afternoon of September 20th, through which James Longstreet just pours troops through that hole. including a lot of the guys that have been at Gettysburg. So if you look at this map, here you have Joseph Kershaw, South Carolinians, Benjamin Humphreys, that's Barksdale's Mississippians from the Battle of Gettysburg. You got Evander Law, you've got Benning's Georgians, you've got Robertson. Almost everybody on this map, with the exception of Fulton and Gregg on the left, are from the Army of Northern Virginia. And this is a similar Eastern type attack. They're going through these fields. Dyer Field happens to be one of the largest fields on the Chickamauga battlefield that's cleared. And in pours, John Bell Hood's division. And these guys will fight their way across the fields and finally going to get stymied in and around Horseshoe Ridge on the outskirts of that, where Yankee desperate reinforcements that are being sent will finally stop the last major attack by Hood's Texas. And as they're doing that, John Bell Hood will go down with he's shot in the leg. He's eventually going to lose that leg. But again, Hood, people didn't even realize the guy was on the field early on. He had jumped onto a train in Richmond with his horse and had only shown up in Virginia or in Georgia after most of his men had already arrived. And so he's on this battlefield where he never probably should have been to begin with. And now he suffers a second grievous injury.
So let's see.
Yeah, and this is the final slide, just to finish up in the tactics. As the Union Army is collapsing under the weight of all these attacks, the Kelly salient falls. Most of the Union line is unzipped, and now they start retreating to Chattanooga. In fact, General Rosecrans leaves. James Abram Garfield, his chief of staff, leaves. The Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, happens to be on the field. He's gone. They're all moving back towards Tennessee. And Virginian by the name of George Thomas manages to rally just about everybody that's left on the field. They're going to withstand a whole slew of attacks, including, again, some attacks by some of the Texans, and will manage to save face, at least, to buy enough time for the Union Army to move back to Chattanooga in some semblance of order and establish lines at Chattanooga. So with that, Chickamauga is over. It's the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Some 35,000 men are gunned down. Some guys taken prisoner, of course, but most of them are casualties. So that's, in essence, the story of what happens at the battle. And again, the book, we have a ton of stories of individual soldiers, how the battle unfolded for them. So I would refer people to Joe's in my book if you want to know a lot of the details. Yeah,
well, that's a great segue for one thing. So we've got multiple comments on where to purchase the book. So across the bottom, you can see there's a scrolling thing that there's a promotional code from Savas Beatie. You can go to their website directly and buy the book rather than go through Amazon, rather than go through a secondary seller. And if you use that code, you can get 20% off on it. That's I'm assuming a better way to support Savas Beatie, but also you guys as authors by purchasing directly from them.
Yeah, I mean, Savas actually, we get more money as authors from Savas Beatie, from sales from them than we do from the internet giant, if you will.
Sure.
So yeah, we certainly encourage people to support that effort. Okay. This is, by the way, it is sold at a lot of other retailers as well. So you can ask your favorite Civil War book dealer if they have this book in stock or if they can get it. But of course, the preference would be, use that 20%. I mean, Savas is giving you a nice discount there to begin with.
Yeah. And then Peggy Mundy actually put a link in the comments. So if anybody who previously commented on it, she just threw up the link to the actual specific Savas Beatie website page for the book. So Peggy, thanks for doing that for everybody. Dan Masters is watching, of course. And he says, Scott, your ancestor in the 51st Ohio, was he at Chickamauga or did he join later? So you can.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. My ancestor joined, believe it or not, lied about his age and enlisted at the age of 15 in February of 1864 in the 51st. So he fought in the Atlanta campaign, Franklin, Nashville, etc. Did not fight at Chickamauga. Although what's fascinating, he was the last Civil War soldier left alive in East Central Ohio when he died in 1937. My mom was 13 years old at the time, and she had tons of stories of his fights at Franklin and Nashville. So, I'm one generation away from hearing the actual stories from the man's lips.
Wow, that's tremendous. Well, Dan also gave us a nice gift here because he gave the perfect question for our last 10 minutes or so. And then it'll give Joe an opportunity to talk about some accounts and some things. Maybe both of you will have lots to say about this topic. But Dan says one of the things that really impressed him about your book was the superb post-war accounts from the newspapers and things. And he asked if you could speak a little bit about how you went finding these post-war accounts. And then also maybe you can mix in a little bit what really the historic legacy of the Texans' role at the Battle of Chickamauga. So I'll just kind of leave that broad. You guys can take either angle on that, and then we'll let me. While you're talking that, I'll pull up the picture of the monument, the Texas monument. Here we go. And so, yeah, let's talk about those newspaper accounts because I love the post-war newspaper. I rely on that with my Seattle research. So I'm curious about how you found those for all these different units and things and what you did with them.
Well, Texas is very fortunate to have a database from the University of North Texas. It's called Portal to Texas History. And they have digitized newspapers from the 1700s all the way to today. And once you learn how to use the database, you can type in a keyword like Chickamauga, and it will bring up all the newspapers that talk about Chickamauga. You can bring up the year, Chickamauga 1863, and it will narrow it down. And then you can type in Chickamauga 1863 Hector's Brigade, and it will narrow down the newspapers. And you go through a lot of the newspapers. For every gem that we find, there's about 50 articles that we don't, that just really doesn't have anything to do with what we're looking for. Portal to Texas History also has rare books that you cannot check out, but they're digitized. They're located at the State Library in Austin, but unfortunately, you can't really get your hands on them, but they're digitized, so they're right there. So I really recommend anybody who wants to research anything about Texas history, go to Portal to Texas History. Also, newspapers.com is where you get a lot of these accounts from as well. You just have to learn how to use the databases and the keywords, and also newspaperarchive.com. I also went to pretty much the unofficial archives of Hood's Texas Brigade. It's at the Texas Heritage Museum up in Hillsboro, Texas, right outside of Waco. It's between Waco and Dallas. Outstanding, not only about Hood's Texas Brigade, but I got a lot of the accounts from other brigades at this library, at this archive. So it's called Texas Heritage Museum Historical Research Center. That's another place. Baylor University, if you type in any kind of university, let's say if you're kind of interested in learning about the Mississippians that fought at Gettysburg, go onto the University of Mississippi website, type in archives, go type in Gettysburg, and pretty much it'll have, by and large, all the accounts and the books that they have that talk about Gettysburg. So what would take us years and years and years and years, 30 years ago, you can pretty much do almost within a couple of days. And that's a quick rundown.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add, because it's the most amazing thing to me is having written a book on Louisianans, famed Louisiana Tigers in the Gettysburg campaign, I would suggest there are 20 times as many contemporary reports in post-war newspaper accounts from the Texans about what happened at Chickamauga than there are from Louisianans about what happened, to them at Gettysburg, for example. So when Joe kept sending me file after file after file after file of all these newspaper accounts for me to wade through and try to, cohesively, put into this narrative that I wrote in the book, I was just stunned because the sheer volume of that. I mean, frankly, I was a little jealous, wishing the Louisianans would have had the same database and the same amount of care of attention, and that these guys would have written that many post-war accounts. So yeah, it was just a stunning amount of research that Joe put into this. Wow.
Did you find, so I know there's a fair amount historically about the Texas Brigade itself, as far as letter collections and memoirs and that sort of thing. But with these other Texas units, like say the 25th Cavalry or the 7th Texas and things, did you find that there were regimental histories or things with regimental associations or anything like that that were useful? Because it seemed like that'd be hard to find if it even existed for some of these lesser known Texas regiments. How did you do that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I'll finish on my comment. file after file after file. Joe was sending me stuff on Actors Brigade, on Greg's guys. I mean, these guys wrote probably as prolifically as did Hood's Texans.
Okay.
So there's a massive amount of stuff out there on all of these guys, and frankly, we didn't use everything.
Yeah.
We had accounts from these guys that we just simply couldn't fit in because they were redundant or they were too long or whatever.
Sure.
But it's just stunningly, it's every single Texas, with the possible exception of the cavalry. I think we're the lightest in the book on accounts from the 8th and 10th Texas Cavalry, the two regiments there, because those guys just didn't write as much after the war.
Yeah.
But the infantry guys and the dismounted cavalry, oh my goodness, it's amazing what we found.
Wow, that's tremendous. Well, let's end on this. Of all the accounts that you found in letters or newspaper accounts or in memoirs or whatever, what was each of you can have this question. What was your favorite, so to speak, the one that like captivated you? Because man, the way he wrote about it, or I had no idea about this fact or something that you were like, man, if I had, this is the diamond of all the stuff we found in this book to you personally.
I don't think this is come much as a surprise to Scott, but there is a color sergeant from Getty's who was part of the 1st Texas Brigade called George Bernard. He was from Galveston Island, Texas. He was fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was blown off a rock at the Devil's Den, and he was also the color bearer at Chickamauga. His account was about once he arrived in Chickamauga, he was right there fighting with a young Georgia boy, part of a Georgia regiment. And for some reason, the Georgia boy just decided he wanted to tell Sergeant Bernard his life story. Said, this is where I'm from, this is where I'm raised, and, this is my first time in battle. And Bernard said, why are you telling me this? I don't know who you are. And the young boy said, well, I have a premonition. This is going to be my last battle. This is going to be my first and last battle. And, of course, Bernard said, yeah, it's okay. I don't think it's going to happen. Well, 10 minutes later, this young man shot his first round at a Union position, and right then a bullet went right through his forehead.
Wow.
Just boom. And so to me, that was just wow. This young man knew he was going to die in battle. There was a lot of premonitions throughout all the wars that happens to. But Bernard was just saying, this young man just came up to me and told me his story. I didn't know who he was. I even went up to the officer and said, I'm kind of worried about one of your soldiers here. He's thinking he's going to die. And the young officer told Bernard, well, I know his mother. I'll take a look after him and stuff. But it didn't make a difference because he was killed soon after.
Wow. And Scott, what do you have in that regard that really resonated with you?
Yeah, one of the things that I think really hit home with me, I did a long study that turned into a chapter in a book on the U.S. Army Hospital here in York, Pennsylvania, where I live. So the medical side of this, of what we did for the Chickamauga book, has fascinated me in particular. And there are accounts of, Texas soldiers that are, in fact, there's a sergeant, I can't think of his name off the top of my head. Joe, you probably do. But he's at a field hospital, and he has one of the most vivid descriptions of what's going on at the field hospital, with all around him with, as he's waiting his turn to find out what's going to happen to him. And, soldiers are screaming, their legs are getting cut off, their arms are getting cut off. And, this guy's basically the terror of what's going to happen to him just strikes through in his reading. What was the guy's name, Joe? I can't think of it. Was the sergeant.
William Fletcher, Bill Fletcher.
Yes, Bill Fletcher. Yes, thank you so much. I knew I brain dead there for a second. But yeah, Bill Fletcher is just an incredibly detailed writer. He's all over his part of the battlefield. He talks about leaving the battlefield and walking back to a train station to take a train ride back to a field hospital in Georgia. So, just the medical stuff just fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, and finally, we're rated about an hour, so we'll wrap it up here in a second. But while I'm looking at the monument here, while you guys are talking, this is similar monument to the Texas Monument at Gettysburg, and I'm assuming isn't there one on the Wilderness Battlefield that's
Antietam,
this
yeah.
on the same shape and material and everything?
Shiloh.
Shiloh has one as well. What do you think? Do you think Texas is this particular battle and their role in this campaign is appreciated historically enough or do you wish this? I mean, of course you wish, because you wrote the book and you wish people would buy it and they would become aware of it because of the work you did. But do you think this is something that it fits right in the historical legacy, or you think it's underrated, or where do you think they stand historically now that you've spent all this time studying them? Do you think they have gotten their due historically, or they're still like they need to get more and more and more than even you guys have provided?
Yeah, I'll just answer real quickly, and then Joe will let you finish. I think again, all the stuff that Joe has uncovered from these soldiers' accounts, most books on Chickamauga, most books, not all, are heavily slanted towards Union accounts because those are what's most prevalently available.
Yeah.
So you tend to get a lot of, particularly the older books. I mean, Dave Powell does a great job of both sides with his more recent books. When you go back to the older books, they are heavily slanted towards the, either one or two Confederate units, but it's really about the Union accounts because that's what's so prevalent. So I think we accomplished what we wanted to do, and that was to try to bring this story of the individual soldiers from Texas back to life.
I agree with Scott. To me, Gettysburg gets all the glory, and Chickamauga is a little brother. Even back when the 50th anniversary of the battle was a big deal for the Gettysburg, rightly so, of course, 19th century reunion. Well, all the newspapers talked about the Gettysburg reunion, but they also had a 50th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga, which was not nearly as covered as much as Gettysburg. It's romanticized. The Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia are romanticized ever since the war was over. And a lot of people, for some reason, really didn't know much about the Western Theater, maybe because it was too spread out. It wasn't as concentrated of battles as it was on the Eastern Theater. I agree with Scott. It was very heavily slanted towards, everybody knew about George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, or other Union generals. They knew that Braxton Bragg, well, he's the Army, he was the general that was the worst general we ever had, and all this. But I think now with the advent of the internet and with databases, that I think a lot more will be available for people to read more about the Western Theater. So to me, Chickamauga and Gettysburg are pretty much parallel.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I certainly benefit from that. I'm 2,000 miles from the nearest anything that happened in the Civil War, so I live off of digital resources in my work, and it's a great era to be a historian and a researcher and a writer because, man, like you said 30 years ago, to dig up all the accounts that you have, the amount of legwork and Xerox copies and whatnot. If you look at some of the previous generation of historians that have donated their files to museums or historical societies, it's mind-numbing just to even go through that, much less have collected it. So I think you're right. Maybe the pendulum will swing a little bit. It's swinging back much in the favor of George Meade and George McClellan, with a lot of scholarship lately. So maybe the Western Theater Confederates will benefit from some different perspectives going forward. But your book really sets a stage for that, I think, and is kind of a new standard for that soldiers level view, which is what people really resonates with people now, I think. So it's a great approach. And so with that, I want to obviously thank you guys for coming on. I know it's a lot to cover, and we rushed through everything, but I didn't want it to just be a PowerPoint. I really wanted to hear your perspective on things and throw some other questions and get your feelings, like why and how you did this too. I think that's as important as discussing what's in the book. So now everybody go buy the book. Like we said, Peggy put a link in the comments there with the specific link for the book, and there's on the bottom of the screen now a code from Savas Beatie. This is the best way to support these guys and their work. Thanks for you guys for joining us and staying up late on the East Coast and everywhere. And thanks for everybody who tuned in. We had a nice audience tonight that stuck around the whole time. So you guys are captivating guests. I don't think we lost many people along the way here. So that's pretty good. So this will be available also on here on Facebook, and then also archived on YouTube. So if you guys ever want to go and get this link to to share around, or or whatever. It's permanently on the internet, so it's good that you didn't make any mistakes or embarrass yourselves, because it's out there now for good. So, all right, guys. Well, thanks a lot for being here, you guys and the guests and everybody. And we'll catch you in a couple weeks for our next Savas Beatie presentation. So thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you much.
Thank you.